All right, guys, so here we go with video number 2 for chapter 26, titled A New Kind of War. So I mentioned at the beginning of the previous video how World War I was different from any previous war the world had seen, and that's going to be the focus of this video. It was the largest conflict in history up to that point, and it used modern technology to incredibly destructive effects. A lot of casualties in this war, way more than we've seen in any other war so far in history. Now, most of the fighting in World War I took place in Europe, specifically an area of France that became known as the Western Front. Right, now, it was called the Western Front because it was the Western Front from Germany's perspective. Right? Remember we said Germany went through Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan, and then the French and the British troops really kind of solidified themselves in. And so the Western Front went all the way from the English Channel down, into the Alsace-Lorraine area down here, a couple hundreds of miles. But this is where the majority of the fighting in Europe took place. It's also where most of the more fighting in the war took place along this front than any other area in the world. Okay, so the Schlieffen Plan. Let's go back talking about that. Well, the Schlieffen Plan failed. Belgium delayed Germany longer than Germany had expected, and that allowed the French to really fortify their positions. It allowed time for the British to come in and get involved as well. And plus, Russia, on the other side, mobilized faster than expected. So this drew some of Germany's attention away from France, and so they weren't able to kind of give everything they had into capturing Paris, which is down here. So Germany never captured Paris, excuse me, and the Schlieffen Plan was a failure. Now, the Western Front was characterized by a style of fighting that became known as trench warfare. All right, why? Because both sides literally dug hundreds and hundreds of miles of trenches. Now, you see from this diagram how it wasn't just kind of your basic little ditch that was, you'd have different layers to it. Let me erase this. All right, so you got the front line trench, you've got your support trenches, you've got your reserve trenches, and then your long-range artillery would be all the way in the back. And you notice how there are connecting trenches as well. It was kind of a whole system of it. And then once you got up in here, then you had your kind of more shallow, barely dug in trenches, because this was the area that people had to kind of run back and forth. You had barbed wire all along in here. You notice aircraft that were kind of going over doing reconnaissance. We'll talk more about them later. But your artillery ones, this was big because they would just fire over into the opposing side. I didn't mean to do that, but I'll get to them in a second. And the frontline trenches would be dug just far enough away so they would be out of range of the long-range artillery. This area in here, you can kind of make it out. I'm going to talk about that later. No man's land. All right, as I said, I'll talk more about that in a second. So this is what your basic trench system looked like. You had your duck boards so that you weren't stepping in the mud and the rain, your fire steps, your sandbags in order to protect from rain overflow and from it collapsing, little steps, that you'd have to step up into, dugouts that the troops would sleep in, and then they could go in there for shelter as well. Life in the trenches really was very, very rough. The conditions were horrible. They were not fun. I mean, this doesn't look like it would be a fun place to stay for more than an hour or two, let alone weeks or months that some of them were in. Outbreak of disease was a very big concern, and the rain and the rats were sometimes worse than the bullets themselves. So not fun. And at some point, the troops would hear the call for over the top, at which point they would charge towards the opposing line. And in between the opposing line of trenches, as I just mentioned here, was an area known as No Man's Land. Now, No Man's Land looked like an apocalyptic war zone. All right, this was the area where the artillery shells would hit. This was the area where, the majority of the fighting took place. You had landmines in there, all the craters. If there were houses, if there were trees in there, they were wiped out. Okay, this really was as bad as you could get. And because No Man's Land was so difficult to cross, it was very difficult for either side to really get any type of advantage, leading to a situation known as a stalemate. Now, a stalemate is when neither side is able to gain any significant advantage. And the battle lines in France would remain relatively unchanged for several years of fighting. And a big reason why a stalemate was created was because of the new technology that had emerged with World War I, specifically the military technology. World War I was the first war to fully utilize industrialized military weapons, such as machine guns and long-range artillery. Now, they were invented prior to World War I, but this was the first time that they were used on this scale. And as we just talked about, the machine guns made crossing no man's land practically impossible. And even if you survived the bullets, you had long-range artillery shells raining down at you at all all times. So, it really made kind of gaining any type of advantage difficult because both sides had it, right? The British and the French had it, the Germans had it, and it, rose the casualty rate significantly and also helped create that stalemate that we just talked about. You also had some new developments like poison gas, right? And this was new for World War I. And it was first used by the Germans in 1915. And poison gas, it could blind you and it could also choke soldiers by ripping apart your esophagus and lungs and so forth. And obviously it could be fatal. Soldiers eventually were given gas masks that they would carry with them in these pouches you see in front of their chests. But they were crude and didn't always fully filter out the gas. Plus, you didn't like wearing them because they could be very constricting. Other new developments were in the vehicles that you saw. There were the three big new vehicles used in World War I. You had tanks, you had airplanes, and you had submarines. Now, the tanks we'll talk about first. They didn't have the firepower of later tanks, right? You don't see the big kind of artillery turrets that are coming out of here. But they could still be used to cross smaller trenches and roll over barbed wire, so they still served a useful purpose. Airplanes were still pretty new. You see the biplanes. They were called that because of their two levels of wings that they had. These were not really big enough to have a offensive impact. They couldn't be used to drop bombs or anything like that. They were mostly used for surveillance. They'd fly over the opposing trenches and then report back on what they saw, or for one-on-one dogfighting. Large balloons called zeppelins were used. All right, think of these as blimps that could then be used to drop bombs on top of the opposing side. But they weren't that effective either. Submarines, though, they were very effective, specifically the U-boats. U-boats were German submarines, came from the term the Unterseeboats, and they did tremendous damage to the Allied ships in the Atlantic. They attacked not only naval ships, but also merchant ships, and it got to the point where the merchant ships had to start traveling in convoys where they would travel in groups surrounded and protected by warships. Now, World War I was mostly fought in Europe, but it was an actual world war due to the fighting that took place around the world. Now, remember, one of the central powers was the Ottoman Empire, right? So as a central power, that meant that they were allies with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And the Ottoman Empire still controlled large sections of the Middle East. It was centered here in Turkey. Okay, the Ottomans themselves were Turks, but it also controlled areas here through Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. The Turks had cut off important supply lines from the Mediterranean to Russia and Central Asia through a region called the Dardanelles. Okay, here's the Dardanelles here. Here's the Mediterranean. Here's the Black Sea. Russia would just be north of it. So if ships wanted to get from Central Asia or Russia into the Mediterranean, you'd have to go through here, and so they cut it off. This was so important that a massive battle was actually fought for the Dardanelles that resulted in more than 200,000 casualties. Now, the fact that the Ottomans were enemies of Russia, remember Russia is one of the allies, it resulted in a really horrible occurrence known as the Armenian Massacre. Now, Armenia is a region of Turkey kind of up and around here, okay? This is where Armenia would be. And the Armenians were Christians living in a Muslim empire. That meant that they were going to side and be more sympathetic towards Russia, okay, which would be up here to the north. And because of this, the Turks looked at them as being potential traitors, and so in retaliation, they killed or deported hundreds of thousands of them. Let me just erase all this. All right, forced them from their home, and in the trek, many of them starved to death. They were outright shot. Here you see a picture of mass graves of Armenians being buried by the Turks, and many today consider this to be an act of genocide of the Turks trying to wipe out the Armenians. Now, the Turks also had to deal with Arab revolts, right? You look down through here, this region, these regions are Arab. The Ottomans, they are Turks. As I said, Turks and Arabs are not the same ethnicity. And so the Arabs living in these areas, they wanted their independence, and the British used this to their advantage. They would supply the Arabs with guns and ammunition and so forth and try and help them rebel against the Turks. It was thought that that would weaken the Ottomans and then help the British cause. Also, it's important to remember that most of the major players in the war, like Germany, Britain, France, they were imperial powers, and they wanted to add their opponents' colonies to their empires. And because of this, fighting took place in the colonies. Here you see a map of the German colonies. All right, here's Germany up here, and you see the blue areas of German African colonies. You see how they controlled some areas, spheres of influence in China. They controlled some areas in the Pacific and Indonesia and so forth. The British and the French wanted to drive them out of there. They wanted to control these because it would add to their empires and it would weaken their opponents. Also, on top of this, you saw people from the colonies that would be drafted into service. For instance, the Battle of the Dardanelles that I just mentioned, a large portion of the British forces were made up of soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, and India, which were part of the British Empire at the time. Okay, so that wraps things up for Section 2, and in Section 3, we're going to be getting into how the war ends.